Welcome and thank you for joining this Chain and Plan seminar, which is hosted by the Grantham Institute at Imperial and run by myself, Ben, Ariana, and Anna, who are all part of the Science and Solutions for a Change and Planet DTP. This is the first seminar of the new, no, it's not. But we'd like to welcome everyone to the seminar and stay up to date with our latest events, join our mailing list to receive newsletters and follow us on social media. Ben will drop all those links into the chat just now. So just a few housekeeping that you need to be very aware of before I introduce Nathalie. This session is going to be recorded, and please ensure that your microphone remains on mute if you're attending online, and if you're attending in person, please keep your masks on for the duration of the talk. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat online, and we'll be able to pass the mic around at the end for any in-person questions. This is the first time holding a hybrid event, so please bear with us if there are any technical glitches, but hopefully there won't be. So yeah, with that being said, I'm Patrick. I'll be chairing the seminar today, and it comes following COP26 that was held in Glasgow at the beginning of November, and the virtual meeting of the CPP COP15. Which is before the in-person meeting of next year. In light of these two really important gatherings that will determine our trajectory in tackling both climate and biodiversity crisis in the coming years, the theme for this seminar this term is translating research into policy, informing outcomes and implementing actions. Bringing you seminars that highlight the role of science in decision-making processes in the implementation of proposed policy and the monitoring of progress towards goals. In that regard, it's my pleasure to welcome our speaker for today, Nathalie Seddon, who is a Professor of Biodiversity and Founding Director of the Naturebased Solutions Initiative at the University of Oxford. Nathalie trained as an ecologist at Cambridge University and has over 20 years of research experience in a range of ecosystems across the globe. As a University Research Fellow of the Royal Society, she developed a broad research interest in understanding the origins and maintenance of biodiversity and its relationship with global change. She is a Senior Associate of the International Institute for the Environmental Development and a Senior Fellow at Oxford Markham School. Nathalie guides governments, UN agencies and businesses on nature-based solutions and is currently a friend of COP26, one of the 30 global experts currently advising the UK government on its presidency of the UNFCCC's Climate Change Conference, COP26. Nathalie today will speak about the role of nature-based solutions to climate change and the promises and pitfalls of such interventions. So without much further ado, over to you, Nathalie. Thank you and welcome.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you all today. It's great. Great that this is a hybrid event. Yeah, I am keen to talk to you and address this question that's on the slide, title slide for this talk. Can nature-based solutions deliver a win-win for biodiversity and climate change adaptation? And certainly we will be covering the promise and pitfalls of nature-based solutions as part of that. So I hope you'll all agree with me that the science is really quite clear. Biodiversity loss and climate change are undermining the development gains of the last 2 centuries and represent huge and increasing risks to the global economy, to health, well-being around the world. Over half the world's GDP is highly or moderately dependent on a healthy planet. Yet without drastic emissions reductions, we will go way beyond actually 2 degrees of warming and lose between 0.5 and 1 million species by the end of the century. This is according to recent IPCC reports and also the global assessment produced by NbSs a couple of years ago. So our failure to slow biodiversity loss or address climate change in any meaningful or effective way, and the urgent need to stimulate economic recovery without causing more damage, locking in more damage to the climate and the biosphere, means that we need to very quickly scale up much more coherent and much more ambitious approaches to tackling these challenges. So nature-based solutions are one such family of approaches that work with technological and social solutions. It's important to say right from the get-go that I'm not presenting nature-based solutions as an alternative to what we must achieve with technology and societal change. But they are a family of approaches that has recently become very prominent in international policy and business discourse. I'm sure some of you are aware of this. For example, nearly half the world's nations have signed the UK-led Leaders Pledge for Nature, and in so doing have committed to significantly scaling up nature-based solutions, while two-thirds, or over two-thirds actually, of nations include nature-based solutions very prominently in their climate change pledges, either as part of their mitigation and or adaptation plans. And for the first time, really, nature was a very dominant theme at the UN Climate Summit at COP26. For those of you who were there, I'm sure you would agree with me, and major new initiatives, funding streams and programs for nature-based solutions were announced. The term nature-based solutions ultimately fell from the final decision text, and we could maybe have a discussion about that if you're interested in, as part of the Q&A at the end of this presentation. But nonetheless, nature-based solutions were in the Glasgow Climate Pact decision text in all but name. But what are they? And indeed, this is an important and non-trivial question, because there's a lot of confusion about what nature-based solutions are. And in fact, that's what underpins why we lost those three words from the text in the final days of the conference. Put very, very simply, nature-based solutions are actions that involve working with nature, with our natural ecosystems, specifically to address societal goals, whilst also producing local biodiversity and human wellbeing benefits. They include restoration, connection and protection of natural and semi-natural ecosystems on land and also in the sea. It's very important to remember the sea. We often overlook the oceans when it comes to nature-based solutions, but they're profoundly important in the sea as well. The sustainable management of working lands and seascapes, including our timberlands and our croplands. The incorporation of nature-based agricultural practices such as agroforestry. And nature-based solutions can, under certain circumstances, also involve the establishment or the creation of new ecosystems across the landscape, but in particularly such as bringing blue and green infrastructure into our towns and cities. And by blue infrastructure, I mean freshwater infrastructure into our towns and cities. So the idea of a nature-based solution sort of gained traction, partly because it arises from the understanding from science and from practice that natural ecosystems, natural habitats support human societies in multiple ways. And some of these are illustrated on this infographic here. You know, we know that healthy ecosystems basically are a life support system. They provide our food, our clean water, our shelter, they store carbon, and they can protect us from the impacts of extreme events such as floods, droughts, and heat waves, which are becoming much more common under climate change. The concept also is grounded in the knowledge that climate change and biodiversity loss share some of the same drivers, and so in theory at least share some of the same solutions. We know that land use change for industrial agriculture, for example, is both the biggest driver of biodiversity declines, accounting for around 30% of declines into global terrestrial habitat integrity, and the second biggest source of greenhouse gases, accounting for between 23 and 24%. So in theory, protecting and enhancing carbon stores through the restoration and protection of natural ecosystems can therefore, in theory, both reduce warming and slow biodiversity declines. But this scenario, as I'm sure you'd appreciate, is in no way guaranteed. And some so-called nature-based solutions, particularly those that involve planting trees in naturally treeless habitats, or planting monoculture plantations in biodiverse lowland forest, can have very negative outcomes for biodiversity for local people. Now, there's been a lot of emphasis on this problem in recent talks, in recent publications, and we can indeed really discuss that aspect of the nature-based solutions debate in more detail in questions if people would like to. But really, in this talk, I want to focus on the role, often overlooked, of the role of nature-based solutions to supporting human adaptation to climate change, whilst also supporting biodiversity. So this is one of the most important aspects of nature-based solutions to keep in mind. There are many critical ways they can reduce the vulnerability of the ecosystems and the people dependent upon them to the climate change that's already locked into the system. And actually, the term nature-based solutions, which was initially coined by the World Bank in 2008, arose from the work on ecosystem-based adaptation and biodiversity conservation. It's only quite recently, last couple of years, that it's kind of been co-opted by the mitigation community, and we can return to that. So what do we mean by supporting adaptation? Well, we're going to really get into this in this talk. But for example, so these are the 4 broad categories of nature-based solutions: protection, so protecting ecosystems, coastal ecosystems in particular, but not exclusively, can defend against storm surges, coastal erosion, seawater, saltwater intrusion, and so forth. So all these ecosystems, the seagrass meadows, the kelp forests, the salt marshes, the mangrove forests, the oyster reefs, and so on, can protect those coastlines. Restoring ecosystems, so for example, restoring forests and wetlands, can secure and regulate water supply, whilst also shielding infrastructure and communities and property from landslides, erosion, and floods. Improve management, so nature-based agriculture such as floating gardens or agroforestry can increase the resilience of food and indeed water supplies, or food supplies in particular, to pests, diseases and climate extremes. And the establishment of green and blue infrastructure in cities, we know, can help with cooling and flood abatement, whilst also bringing multiple benefits for mental and physical health and reducing air pollution. So sort of a very high-level overview of how these broad different categories of nature-based solution can support aspects of adaptation to climate change and can build our resilience. So I want to sort of start really by placing nature-based solutions within this conceptual framework, to put this in your mind before we start taking a deeper dive on the evidence. So nature-based solutions, I think, can be very usefully and importantly viewed as those actions that integrate the human, the social system on one side with the ecological system on the other. And it highlights that deep interdependency of the vulnerability of the ecosystem to climate change and the vulnerability of human societies to climate change. So I want to just briefly talk through this. So in each system, you can see that there are 3 interrelated pathways to vulnerability, to reducing vulnerability. The first is exposure. So that is the extent to which a region, ecosystem, resource, or community is impacted by climate change. The second is sensitivity to these impacts. That is the degree to which a system is affected by or responsive to those effects. And the third is the adaptive capacity of the system. That is the ability of the system, be it ecological or social, to adjust or innovate in response to changing, challenging conditions. So if we're sort of thinking about the ecosystem part of this, so ecosystem exposure is the extent to which ecosystems are actually subjected to droughts, floods, landslides, fire, and so forth. And this is determined by exogenous as well as endogenous factors. So it is determined by the intensity, duration, and frequency of events. It can be determined by the geomorphology and biophysical properties of the ecosystem. And critically, it also depends on the extent of use and management of the ecosystem, of natural resources, by human societies. So exposure is influenced by all those factors. Ecosystem sensitivity, meanwhile, is the degree to which an ecosystem's structure and function alters as a result of a different perturbation. So ecosystem exposure combined with ecosystem sensitivity creates a potential impact. And this is then buffered by the adaptive capacity of the ecosystem. So both ecosystem sensitivity and adaptive capacity are determined by ecological traits, so the diversity, heterogeneity, and connectedness of the ecosystem, and the characteristics and components of its of its component species and habitats. So overall, an ecosystem's vulnerability is shaped by the combination of potential impact and adaptive capacity. I hope that's clear. So this ultimately, and this is a critical bit, is this ultimately affects the delivery of ecosystem goods and services upon which people and economies depend. So in this way, ecosystem vulnerability affects socioeconomic vulnerability. In other words, the degree to which the social system is adversely impacted by climate change. Socioeconomic sensitivity is also influenced by a wide range, you can imagine a very long list and wide range of interacting social, political, and economic factors. Likewise, socioeconomic adaptive capacity that can moderate that potential impact from social exposure and sensitivity includes the ability of human societies to innovate in the face of change and challenges. So nature-based solutions is powerful, I would argue, because it can bring and must bring together all these different elements. If implemented properly and equitably, it can decrease social ecological vulnerability. And that's the key thing, if implemented properly and equitably. So nature-based solutions isn't sort of conservation business as usual. It's not about separating people from nature. It's about people as part of nature. And that's a really important thing to bear in mind. So that's a sort of the theory. What is the evidence for this? What is the evidence that working with nature can provide these benefits in these different ways, in these different interactive ways? Of course, it's not that easy to answer that question. You need to do lots of research, but what you first of all need to do is bring together existing research, because it turns out there are thousands and thousands of relevant studies that can inform answers to this question, dispersed across hundreds and hundreds of different journals from across multiple different disciplines, economics, political science, physical sciences, natural sciences, social sciences, the whole range, and multiple journals within each of those disciplines. This kind of evidence is found within that. So you have to conduct a systematic mapping exercise, a systematic review. And we did this a couple of years ago. We published it in 2020, but the whole process took 2 or 3 years for us to do this, because there were thousands, as I say, of potentially relevant papers. And this was just initially our analyses were just in the peer-reviewed literature. And we recognise that a lot of understanding about the effectiveness of nature-based solutions is to be found in the grey literature, but we just started with the peer-reviewed literature. More recently, we've been bringing this together with the grey literature. So we're looking at the effectiveness for people, for ecosystems, and in terms of the climate change impacts concerns of implementing nature-based solutions. This isn't going to be the core of my talk, but I just want to sort of present the evidence tool and the systematic map, which is sort of like the foundation for lots of other publications and analyses that have followed from them. And so, there were, over 12,000 potentially relevant studies. It's through a very laborious process, which we can surely speed up using AI, machine learning, and so forth, and we're working on that. But we found over 200 empirical studies that were really relevant or would help us answer this question, and 187 scenario modelling studies. And most of these studies, you can see, were published in relatively recent times. There's been a real uptick of research in this space in recent times. And you can explore this evidence on what's called the Nature-Based Solutions Evidence Tool, Evidence Platform, where you can filter for ecosystems, climate change impacts, positive outcomes, negative outcomes for people, for biodiversity, and so forth, to find the subsets of papers within, this specific area of interest. So I do you to take a look at that, and if you have any feedback on that for us, that would be great. So this has presented a global picture. What we found, a huge bias in studies towards the Americas and also from China. We found overall that most of the interventions in semi-natural and natural ecosystems were reported in these studies to have ameliorated adverse climate impacts. We found that interventions involving created ecosystems, so in particular afforestation, so planting trees in naturally treeless habitats, were associated with trade-offs. And these studies primarily reported reduced soil erosion or increased vegetation cover, but lower water availability and lower biodiversity. And overall, the studies reported more synergies and trade-offs between reducing climate impacts and broader social and ecological and climate change mitigation outcomes. So this is like a very quick, high-level overview of what that initial foundational piece of work that we did showed. But the key question is, I think, and certainly perhaps to an audience such as this, is like, how do nature-based solutions deliver these broad benefits? What are the pathways? So review found support for nature-based solutions supporting adaptation via the 3 main pathways presented in that social ecological vulnerability framework. But almost all of the evidence for the role of nature-based solutions in reducing vulnerability comes from studies into their role of reducing exposure to extreme events, in particular damages caused by storm surges, coastal erosion, and such like. And I want to just highlight two recent contrasting examples of the sorts of evidence that we found as part of this review process. This sort of really grounds understanding of some of the interest and complexity around nature-based solution. So this whole pathway one, I guess, is reducing exposure. This is the extent to which a region, ecosystem, resource or community is impacted by events. So this is a really interesting study conducted in the Bay of Bengal, looking at 3 breakwater oyster reefs that were created on an eroding intertidal mudflat. And data was collected over 4 seasons. And what this study found is an experimental study. They found that the reefs, these oyster reefs, so oyster reefs are being implemented as a nature-based solution all over the world, including the UK and Gulf of Mexico and the Bay of Bengal in particular. And this study found that the reefs blocked waves that were less than 0.5 metre high and dissipated wave energy. And on the lee side of these oyster reefs, there was evidence for accretion or growth, or accretion of the sediments and a reduction of erosion. And this was shown to enable the seaward expansion of the salt marsh. And what this study was really interested, why this study is so important, why I wanted to highlight it, is it highlights that sort of, when we think about nature-based solutions, we mustn't think about them acting in isolation from one another. Obviously, ecosystems influence one another, and they can provide these benefits in terms of reducing the exposure of coastlines by working together. So in this case, the oyster reef protects the salt marsh, enables it to grow, and the salt marsh itself was that which then protected the communities, the infrastructure and the properties and so forth, and obviously brought the extra benefits around carbon storage, sequestration, biodiversity and so forth. And a lot of the evidence for nature-based solutions' role in supporting human adaptation comes from the coastal zone for some fairly obvious reasons. An example closer to home, this was a study published a few years ago looking at historic data from major flood events in Northwest Europe in 1717 and 1953. And what this study found was that salt marshes reduce the likelihood and impact of breaching of engineered defences. And the wider the salt marsh, the smaller the breach. And the salt marshes did this by lowering the flood size, by confining the breach size where engineered devices failed. So the key thing here is that, again, like I said at the beginning, we don't think of the nature-based solutions necessarily as an alternative to technological solutions, although there are certain contexts where that must be true and is the case, but also as solutions that can work together. So sometimes in some parts of the world, the intensity of risk from climate change and the threat from flooding and coastal erosion is so high that you need both engineered green and grey solutions working together. And this is a nice example of them working together. And engineering green approaches to building coastal resilience deliver benefits over different timeframes and different spatial scales, and their usefulness and importance also varies with the intensity and the frequency of the threats from climate change. There was also less evidence, but there was also evidence for nature-based solutions delivering benefits by the second pathway, by reducing sensitivity to climate change impacts. And I think the key thing here is that nature-based solutions can sustain diverse sources of livelihoods, in other words, diverse sources of income and also food, which can provide that nutritional and financial security when usual sources of income or crops fail in the face of climate extremes. And this is, I would say, is important all over the world, perhaps particularly so in the global south, where dependency on local resources for nutrition and income is particularly high. For example, there are studies from Vanuatu, another study from Kenya, showing how marine protected areas act as a reservoir of marine resources. And so most of the time, these are marine protected areas that are protecting biodiversity. But when terrestrial-based livelihoods fail, during, for example, this particularly severe El Nino, for example, in these examples here in Kenya and Vanuatu, the rice production was the usual source of income and food. However, that failed during El Nino, and the marine protected areas were briefly opened up during that period and enabled people to survive until growing conditions for rice resumed to normal. There are big questions I'm sure that you're thinking of as how sustainable is that, but it illustrates the point that they can reduce sensitivity in those sort of more extreme circumstances. Now, the third pathway is around enhancing adaptive capacity. And the key thing here is that the process, that social capital as well as natural capital, is built through the implementation of nature-based solutions. Now, there is less evidence for this pathway, but I think this is a really interesting one, and there's certainly some good evidence. For example, the one presented here, this study coming out of the Philippines, which assessed the impact of the community participation in a mangrove restoration project, and how it built social capital, it built social ties, it involved educating people and basically building their ability to deal with future shock and changes. So participation increased the density and diversity of social ties, built trust, it enabled the sharing of resources, networks, and projects. And so here is a really good example. And actually, there was then scaling out of these restoration efforts, because it was, the local communities found it such an important project to be involved with. It produced all the livelihood and the coastal restoration protection benefits, the reduced exposure benefits, but it also brought them closer together and made them more ready for the changes to come. So I think that's a really important area, but further work is needed. So we've done some recent work based on this initial mapping exercise, including deeper analyses, including meta-analyses of the studies we identified. We've been focusing there on the global south and Bangladesh, and we've been looking at the extent to which, in the Bangladesh case, different sorts of nature-based solutions currently being implemented are reducing exposure and sensitivity and building adaptive capacity. And then the other paper, so these both are in preprints at the moment. We shared policy briefs on their key finding at COP26, and you're welcome to take a look at those. They're on our website, the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative. But one of the key why I mention them now is that they really started to try and look at this again, this idea of explore the routes by which nature-based solutions can support people in a rapidly changing world. And what this paper which focused on studies from across the global south highlighted, they really highlighted the importance of the health of the ecosystem. So it was a lot of the way there were many examples wherein restoring and protecting and connecting and sustainably managing ecosystems improved the sensitivity, reduced the sensitivity of the ecosystem, and improved its resilience to the impacts of climate change. And it was via that route that the local communities benefited. So they really pointed to the fundamental importance of ensuring that ecosystem health is supported or enhanced through the implementation of nature-based solutions. And so that sort of sets the stage a little bit for what I really want to spend more time talking about with you today. So a key determinant of ecosystem health is its capacity to resist and recover from perturbation. So this is a nice figure from a paper by Oliver et al. Published quite a few years ago now, but still very relevant. Ideally, we want to have ecosystems that are really resistant to the impacts of perturbation, whatever that might be, pollution, climate change, land use change, whatever those shocks and changes are, and have very fast recovery. So low resistance, high resistance and fast recovery. What we tend to find is spectrum. Some ecosystems, or certain ecosystems in certain states, have high resistance, but then take a long time to recover. So it takes a lot to disturb their ecosystem functions, but then once they are disturbed, they're slow to recover. We've got other situations where actually an ecosystem gets perturbed and the ecosystem functions decline quite easily under perturbations, but they have a very fast response. But the situation we really want to avoid is low resistance and low recovery to perturbations. And there's evidence all over the world that our ecosystems are being pushed into this space as a result of the combined impacts of habitat and ecosystem degradation and climate change. And we know from many empirical and observational and scenario modeling studies conducted, especially over the last 20 years or so, that there are these two key aspects of ecosystems, key ecosystem traits or properties that underpin the resilience of nature and its ability to resist and recover from shocks. One is connectivity of ecosystems. It's important that ecosystems are connected to each other within and between different biome types, and a key reason for this is this allows for the migration and for range shifts to track moving ecological niches as an adaptive response to climate change. But the other key property is biodiversity. And we know that species richness, or taxonomic, functional, phylogenetic richness, safeguards the evolutionary potential of ecosystems. and increases resilience. And there is now good evidence that the more biodiverse and the more connected the ecosystems are, can accommodate climate extremes, pathogens, migration. Although a lot of the evidence initially was from grassland ecosystems, there's increasingly evidence from forested ecosystems and other biomes across the world. Here are three good examples. So in Panama, a 15-year-old tropical planted forest was studied, and it was found that in contrast to high richness mixtures in the plantations, where you had plots with single species in, growth was strongly regulated during climate extremes, and there was much higher mortality during droughts. So high species richness was related to, so plots with higher species richness were more resilient and could maintain their ecosystem functions and biomass production during droughts. In Europe and the USA, this was one study, showed that across 46 experiments which changed grassland plant diversity, it showed that the levels of productivity of low diversity communities with 1 or 2 species in them changed by 50% during climate events, whereas high diversity communities with up to 32 species changed by about 25%. A more recent study from the Western Ghats of India showed a greater stability of carbon capture in species-rich natural forests compared to species-poor, and showed that the rate of carbon capture in plantations was 29% lower in the dry season compared to natural forest plots. And the idea, this is sort of rooted in really sound ecological theory, that biodiversity buffers ecosystems. Different species have different responses to climate extremes, to droughts, floods, pests, and so on. And this enables sustained productivity across a range of conditions. So we know that from experiments, we know that from theory. The other key aspect about diversity is that this can reduce, higher biodiversity in the system can reduce trade-offs among different ecosystem services. So in other words, for example, between erosion and water yield, between biodiversity and carbon storage. And the existence of trade-offs between ecosystem services means that it can be very damaging, very problematic to focus on, say, a single service, a single regulating service. So if we're thinking about coastal protection, and I have these conversations with engineers all the time, we can't just think about putting just tall tree species of a single species up as a coastal defence, because their engineering science will tell them that that's what's going to attenuate wave energy the most. But we know as biodiversity scientists that monoculture plantation is going to not have that resilience. It's going to be very vulnerable to pests, to diseases, to fires, and so forth. So we have to think much more holistically. Otherwise, we'll actually increase maladaptation, increase exposure to risk. And the same applies, though we're not talking about mitigation, the same applies to mitigation. Even if you're only interested in carbon storage, unless you also consider biodiversity, you won't get the carbon storage over the long term. So the more diverse an ecosystem, the more able it is to resist and to recover quickly from shocks and perturbations. So nature-based solutions must support ecosystem health, underpin biodiversity, if they're to support people in a warming world. You can't expect nature to support these ecosystem services unless they are biodiverse. Do nature-based solutions support biodiversity? So, there's a simple answer, and that generally speaking, the extent to which nature-based solution, whether they support biodiversity or not, varies depending on the sorts of intervention. Obviously, protecting existing intact ecosystems, or peatlands, or old-growth tropical forests, or ancient grasslands, or kelp forests, whatever it might be, protecting them or restoring very degraded landscapes to their more natural state can deliver significant benefits for biodiversity. It's sort of self-evident. Lots of work showing that. But then the complexity becomes around the tree plantations and other forms of created ecosystems. So if non-native tree plantations replace, as they often do, sadly, intact native ecosystems, the outcomes for biodiversity, and also, by the way, carbon and water and other things, will generally be poor. But of course, so whether or not nature-based solutions can support biodiversity depends on the baseline. What's your starting point here? Is it an intact ecosystem? Is it a highly degraded landscape? It also depends, and this is where it gets really interesting in my view, the scale at which the benefits for biodiversity are measured. So it might be that locally, something like a plantation is a disaster for native biodiversity. But if it then takes pressure off, say, old growth native forests, then possibly at a national or an international level might actually be of net benefit to biodiversity. So again, you have to think about, this is probably very obvious to this audience, but it's not often thought about that in the policy or practice space. You have to sort of be very clear about the baseline and the scale at which you measure those benefits for biodiversity. So again, building on our big systematic mapping exercises, we recently did this work. This was some work led by Isabel Key, who was in the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative for a couple of years, now moved up to Edinburgh. Some of you may know her. So, the backdrop is, yes, recent research has improved understanding of how nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation affect ecosystem health, but was a lack of understanding the outcomes of interventions that have been aimed at addressing climate change adaptation. Can they also support biodiversity? In other words, can you get that win-win for adaptation and biodiversity that is often talked about? So to address this, we used a systematic review, and we found that there was a robust evidence to include from 80 papers, and this included outcomes of 109 nature-based interventions for climate change adaptation, and also reported on ecosystem health. So a fairly healthy sample of studies to analyse. And so what do we find? Well, just in terms of where the data were coming from, we found the interventions took place across all continents, obviously except Antarctica, and were relatively evenly spread, as you can see here, across Asia, Pacific, Africa, North America, and Europe. But there was fairly low coverage in West Asia and Latin America. So despite this interventions were relatively evenly distributed across different income groups, which was useful. And the interventions most commonly involved restoration or a combination of protection, restoration, and management. A variety of habitats are included, although there was a bias in this evidence base, again, as usual, towards terrestrial habitats. Which is a problem and an evidence gap that needs addressing. So that's sort of an overview of what we were analysing and what the distribution was across ecosystem types and regions. We found that across those 80 studies and 109 interventions, a very wide diversity of different ecosystem health metrics were included. And here they all are. You can see that some broad categories of ecosystem health metrics, such as ones around biodiversity and diversity and biomass were particularly prominent. We'll get back to the sorts of issues with those ecosystem metrics in a minute. But anyway, 33 different ecosystem metrics. We found that most interventions, so 88% of interventions that reported positive outcomes for addressing climate change adaptation. So in other words, studies that showed compared to a baseline reduction in the threats posed by climate change. Now they were across a wide diversity of different climate change impacts, droughts, flooding, heat waves, food insecurity, water quality, and so forth. But most of the interventions that reported a reduction of the impacts from climate change also reported measurable benefits for ecosystem health. So some indication that it is possible to establish or to enable a nature-based solution for adaptation and also support biodiversity, broadly speaking. Now we wanted to sort of do some more quantitative analysis within this, a bit of a meta-analysis, and we wanted to focus in on those studies that reported changes in species richness compared to a baseline as a result of the associated with the intervention. We found across 24 papers, 34 interventions that reported effects on species richness. 25 of these had sufficient data for inclusion in the meta-analysis. And the interventions in this subset were primarily in terrestrial habitats, most commonly involving restoration. And the majority, so 90% of species richness measures were for plants. And what we found is a mean change in species richness around 67% between the treatment and the control or baseline. So this was a conservative estimate, wasn't weighted, and excludes non-native species. But we did a sensitivity analysis and showed that weighting by study design and sample size, adjusting for zero values and excluding response ratios for non-native species and so forth. So we did a whole bunch of sensitivity analysis, and you can learn more about what we did by looking for the publication. This didn't change the direction of the mean effect size. So some evidence that for a subset of studies that those interventions did actually result in an increase, a significant increase in species richness. However, we get to the problem with these studies is that we know, don't we, that biodiversity is this complex, multi-dimensional construct. We need to think about it above ground, below ground. We need to think about interactions between species. We need to think about the functions they perform in the ecosystem. It's a complex thing to measure. And we certainly need to capture the impact of interventions on biodiversity using multiple metrics. And although the multiple metrics are included across all the different studies, most of them only used one or two. That's a problem. And there was a bias towards measuring outcomes for plant species. So interestingly, most of these, 67% of these studies looked at the outcomes on plant aspects of plant, whether biomass or aspects of diversity. And in most of the studies, it was unclear whether native or non-native species were involved, which again is a problem and a confounding factor. And we recognise that some interventions may well have had negative aspects on one aspect of the biodiversity, but the study only reported those where it had a positive outcome. So there's basically there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Huge evidence gaps and real problems with the way the work's been done so far. To improve our understanding of ecosystem health outcomes of nature-based solutions, whether implemented for adaptation, mitigation, or other reasons, we need to assess the impacts of NbS on a much broader suite of ecosystem health outcomes. And we need to really do better in capturing impacts on ecosystem functions, connectivity of habitat patches, soil and water quality, and so forth. We need to assess the effect of nature-based solutions on a much greater range of taxa, so different types of plants, animals, fungi, above ground as well as below ground. And we do need to account for whether species are native to a particular area and thus support local biodiversity, and whether ecosystems will thus be resilient to future environmental change when assessing their ecosystem health outcomes of nature-based solutions. And we need to develop more methodologies that enable accurate, simple, cost-effective and critically replicable measures of ecosystem health. And there's a lot of technology, and I learned about a lot of new technology and recent technology at COP actually when I was there, the use of eDNA and some environmental sensors, remote sensing, and so forth. And these actions will help identify hidden adverse effects on ecosystem health and show how interventions can be better designed to support biodiverse resilient ecosystems so that they can continue to support human societies in a multiple way. Now, as a result, and I'll be wrapping up just within the next 3 minutes actually, so we can get to questions, but as a result of growing awareness and evidence of the critical role of working with ecosystems to help address climate change, both adaptation to and mitigation of, there's huge global momentum around this. As I said at the beginning, there's a Leaders Pledge for Nature, and nature-based solutions were a massive theme at COP26. The corporate sector, private sector, really interested in nature-based solutions. There's some real complexities around that. There are dozens of new funding streams, a Business for Nature coalition, all sorts of things. But there has been a big focus on nature-based solutions for mitigation, especially an overemphasis on tree planting and biodiversity, as well as equity and Indigenous rights and things, but biodiversity in particular is generally overlooked. And this is hugely problematic. And a lot of the current policy policy targets around nature-based solutions are currently encouraging plantations with single non-native species. That might be great for wood production, but it's not a climate solution. And there are problems, as I've mentioned, with this. So, in terms of delivering better ecosystem outcomes for nature-based solutions, we need to widen awareness that nature-based solutions must be explicitly designed to deliver benefits of biodiversity and ecosystem health. We need to incorporate more comprehensive ecosystem health and biodiversity targets in the plans for nature-based solutions, both from the project level to national and international policy level. And we need to really deepen our understanding of how different aspects of ecosystem health relate to different aspects of ecosystem functioning and the provision of ecosystem services, especially and including those that are needed for adaptation and mitigation. We need a lot more funding for the research and monitoring of ecosystem health in a rapidly changing world. And we also very, very quickly need to ensure that all this climate finance that's being generated through from addressing climate change, or that has been pledged by countries and by corporations, is directed towards carefully designed nature-based solutions that support ecosystem health and meet the global standards that there are for nature-based solutions, which is why I would argue that we do need the term nature-based solutions in the decision texts from UNFCCC and also from the Convention on Biological Diversity. At COP, we released this platform because we were aware that people were confused about what nature-based solutions are, despite all our efforts over the last couple of years, and needed examples from around the world of what good looks like. And so we launched this at COP, a global interactive platform for nature-based solutions. There's nearly 100 case studies on there now. We're going to add another 400 or 500 case studies. So these are projects that are biodiversity-based, community-led, that have had their outcomes for adaptation and mitigation reported or measured scientifically. So if this all interests you and you're keen to see a few more examples from around the world, then please do to visit that. Okay, so just end now by thanking my team. I actually need to update this acknowledgement slide. There's a whole new, these folks are involved, but I also got several other people now in the team who have been helping with this and other work that we're doing in the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative in Oxford. So thank you very much. I'll stop talking there and maybe we can have some questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nathalie. That was amazing. Just sort of showing us how restoring, protecting, creating new habitat and improving management can really give benefits for humans and biodiversity. Sort of a bit of a win-win. Cool. And we've got a few questions in the chat. So we have a couple from Artemis. If you want to unmute yourself and give your question, you can do that.
Yes, thank you. So thank you, Nathalie, for this presentation. So my first question is around the distinction between nature-based solutions and natural climate solutions. I have read on WBCSD website, for example, that NCS is part of NbS, but I would be interested in hearing your views and whether you think it's useful to actually make the distinction between nature-based solutions and natural climate solutions, because I also hear others saying, other organizations, from the private sector, saying that we should just call both nature solutions. So I would really like to hear your views on this. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for asking the question. Yes, it's really interesting what's going on in this space actually at the moment. So I see nature-based solutions as being, solutions to a range of societal challenges. I think, and there are some arguing that, natural climate solutions sort of fits within this. As nature-based solutions is the umbrella term, and natural climate solutions is a subset of those where the outcome or the intended outcome of the intervention is to address climate change mitigation. I don't think this is a particularly good idea. I think the problem with focusing on one particular outcome of the intervention, in this case carbon, will produce poor outcomes for local communities and for biodiversity. And then actually in the Natural Climate Solutions Alliance advice for corporates, they only mention biodiversity once in the last few words. And the problem is we need to ensure that finance from both the public and the private sector goes to projects of high integrity that deliver multiple benefits. It's not just carbon benefits, but also adaptation benefits and biodiversity benefits. Because as I said before, even if you're only interested in the carbon, because maybe that's the thing that can be measured and there's a whole voluntary carbon market around that, even if you're only interested in that, you have to support biodiversity. Otherwise, the ecosystem won't have the resilience it needs to deliver those carbon or any other benefits over the long term. So one of the reasons I've sort of been so strong on the, advocating the use of nature-based solutions as a term, it doesn't let you get away with ignoring biodiversity and people. Because we haven't covered it in this talk, but the whole equity issues around it are hugely problematic. If you don't think about local communities, indigenous knowledge, land tenure, land rights, you end up with land grabs. And that was the problem with some of the projects that are implemented under the RED scheme. And local communities and many local communities all over the world really suffered and had their rights ignored and land taken away, ancestral lands taken away from them and so forth. And natural climate solutions was a term that was coined by Griscom, Bronson Griscom, in his very influential 2017 paper, which kind of overestimated the global mitigation potential of nature-based solution of natural climate solutions. There's a real focus there on the mitigation outcomes. I think we should just use nature-based solutions. We can be saying nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation. But if we double down on this definition of nature-based solutions as being community-led and biodiversity-based, we get away from greenwashing, we get away from cheap offsets and all the rest of it. So I think it's a problem, and I'm working with those guys to try and see if we can align things a bit and get biodiversity in there, because I think it's very dangerous to ignore biodiversity for the reasons I've said. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much. I actually have another one, so if the moderator doesn't mind me going through my next one. Yeah, is that okay? Okay, so very quickly. Yeah, so sorry. So the next question that I have is whether you are aware of any private sector's examples, any case studies that you are aware of that the private sector, so private companies have actually implemented nature-based solutions instead of, for example, investing on grey infrastructure.
In the adaptation space, this is all very much in its infancy, the investment. So obviously most private finance for adaptation goes to grey, or at the very most hybrid approaches. I'm now doing a lot of work with the engineering community to really build up the evidence base for the value of working with nature to support infrastructure and so on. This is some work I'm doing with Jim Hall from the Environmental Change Institute, just started doing that because it's not really there. So no, there aren't really very many certainly none that I know of. We don't have any in our platform where the funding has come from the private sector, where the intention has been for adaptation. When it comes to mitigation, there are some examples of some parts of the private sector starting to invest in what I would say good nature-based solutions, but the majority so far that are made publicly available have been investments in monoculture plantation forests. And that's hugely problematic for the reasons I've said.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah, but we're working with the private sector, and we're working with companies to enhance their understanding of what good nature-based solutions look like, and how by investing in those nature-based solutions, you can improve the resilience of your supply chains, because you're going to reduce all those climate change impacts within the supply chains, as well as inset your impacts on climate and biodiversity within them.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Brilliant, great question and answer. Holly has a question, if you want to unmute yourself and ask it.
Hi, Natalie. Thank you for that really great talk. You made the distinction quite early on of what you referred to as so-called nature-based solutions with the negative unseen side effects. In my experience, the current planning process isn't really equipped for an increased rollout of nature-based solutions. Where do you think the accountability should sit for ensuring that NbS are considered thoroughly in the planning stages and then managed and monitored appropriately into the future?
It's a really great question. I don't have a clear answer. It sort of depends on what part of the world, what region you're talking about, who should be the regulatory body. There's international standards. So we're trying to get those international. There's the IUCN Global Standard for Nature-Based Solution, and that went through a 2-year consultation process with people right the way all across the different sectors as to what sort of high integrity projects should look like. And we're doing lots of piloting. I'm on the International Scientific Advisory Committee for the IUCN Global Standard, and so there's going to be a push. I mean, IUCN have developed a certification, an NbS certification scheme. It's about establishing an international body that might help develop regulation for that's appropriate for different regions and different contexts and different industries. There's a real need for robust boundary organisations that help channel finance from good investors to good projects. I mean, these are popping up, but some of them aren't so good. But there's a real important need for that, because what we haven't talked about at all, and actually, I don't really want to get into it, but probably there might be a question about it, is this whole problem around greenwashing. And it's like, it's okay to invest in nature-based solutions so long as you are also doing absolutely everything that you possibly can to decarbonise all aspects of your operations as soon as possible. And that's going to be easier for some organisations than not, relevant for some more than others, but you can't use nature-based solutions to delay or distract from the urgent need to decarbonise, because what the science is really clear on is that unless you decarbonise, you're not going to get any benefits from nature, because the resultant warming of the biosphere will turn it into a net source of greenhouse gases. And there is evidence that this is happening in some parts of the major forested regions of the world. A combination of habitat degradation and destruction combined with climate change is actually turning parts of the biosphere into a net source of greenhouse gas emissions. So unless you deal with that, clearly you've got to keep all the biospheric carbon locked in place. You've got to protect your intact ecosystems. That's sort of nature-based solution number one. But you absolutely, before you start getting into restoration and all the rest of it, you need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. So you need those boundary organizations to vet the investors to make sure they have high integrity, and then you need them to make sure that all this finance generated in a variety of different mechanisms by governments and by the private sector gets to those really good projects on the ground. And we are involved in establishing these and developing standards that are then applied to make sure that the right amounts of financial support in the right form, and that's a whole other business of what's a good financial tool for this and what isn't, get to the right projects. Which is why we're sort of creating these platforms to say these are the sorts of projects that have demonstrable benefits for people, biodiversity, carbon and adaptation. So these are the sorts of things you need to invest in. Sorry, a bit of a waffly answer, but there's various things that need to happen. And what we know there's sort of community of people working in this space are really, focusing on over the next 12 months or so. I mean, well, a massive focus for all of us, in fact.
Thanks very much for the answer.
No problem.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. We have Bethany who asked a question earlier, and then there's a hand in the chat for afterwards. So we'll come to you after with a hand. So Bethany, could you unmute yourself and ask a question, please?
Yeah, amazing, thank you. Thank you, Natalie. Found that really interesting and insightful. My question sort of, I suppose, links to Holly's and kind of the previous conversation sort of about green finance and investment, and how, as you've sort of said, that nature-based solutions sort of have been used as sort of a mitigation tool by green finance and investment. And I suppose, as you've said, working on the regulation of that, and I think the task force for nature-related financial disclosures is hopefully aiming to kind of sort of set the standard. But I suppose in the meantime, how do you think the trends and the developments of nature-based solutions and green finance and investment will go?
Well, there's obviously, a massive amount of work going on here. Lots of companies are now declaring their net zero targets and their nature positive targets. And some of those companies have, figured out how they're going to do that. And not just companies, but countries and other entities are making these claims, but a majority of them haven't really got a plan. You can look under the bonnet and there's like no plan. And so this is why the science community really needs to engage with things like science-based targets and this task force on nature-related financial disclosure to make sure that, that the pathways to getting to those targets do not compromise biodiversity, enhance resilience, or do not compromise equity and so on. And I think there's the massive role for the research community in doing the work in a more timely way to inform this, because the corporate sector, once it decides to do something, moves incredibly quickly, and everyone, all those sort of corporate entities and private sector entities in COP are all talking about biodiversity, they're talking about equity, they're talking about indigenous knowledge. Some of them know what they're talking about, others don't yet, because they need to be. So there's a real important sort of role for sort of these sort of for us to sort of get, I guess, stepping outside our comfort zone and really ensuring that all this understanding we have about what biodiversity is and how ecosystems work is actually informing those corporate and national policies, and really engaging with the TNFD more directly. And certainly I'm involved in certain initiatives that are going to try and do that over the next few months, and to get everything a bit more aligned than it is. So obviously the comment raised initially about NCS versus NbS and all that, that needs sorting out, because that's that's problematic, and we all need to be agreeing on these global standards and so on. So yeah,
amazing, thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you. I know we're coming close to 5 p.m. We have 2 more questions. Is that okay, Nathalie?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, I'm on a roll now. I'm happy to answer.
Keep it coming. Let's go. So we have a hand in the chat if you want to ask a question. You can go ahead.
Hi, Nathalie.
Oh, hello.
So, thank you for such an insightful presentation. So I'm trying to I'm referring to the earlier slides on the findings of the global review, systematic review. So it's quite alarming to find out that from the review, nature-based solutions found to impact water efforts on water availability negatively. I mean, more negatively than positive. Can you please just share how this, I mean, based on some studies find out from the systematic review, how this is happening, and then because my concern is many water companies now are looking at nature-based solutions as their way forward to improve water systems and ensure water availability. So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Great question. And I mean, I could have done a whole talk on that, and those trade-offs, really important to think about them. So that evidence was mainly looking in the context of created ecosystems and afforestation. And a lot of the evidence comes from the lowest plateau and other areas in China, where there's been massive, vast landscape scale afforestation projects that were implemented up to 30 or 40 years ago, and the results of which are now really apparent. And those big mass tree planting programs. So China has a lot of knowledge on nature-based solutions and afforestation and things, which we have a lot to learn from, and that has to inform some of the rollout of these tree planting schemes that are now being pledged to be funded by governments and corporations. And I think the situation is there is the trees it was a very, very degraded post-agricultural landscape, with high levels of erosion, and masses and masses, hundreds of thousands of trees were planted in some areas, and other areas were left to naturally regenerate over time. And what those studies have shown that in the areas where trees were planted, often eucalyptus or acacia or non-native species, you solved the erosion problem quite effectively, and you had carbon benefits, albeit short-term carbon benefits, but they were there. However, that compromised soil moisture content and local water availability, because trees need a lot of water. And so and also biodiversity was pretty low. Meanwhile, in the other landscapes that were allowed to regenerate, there aren't these trade-offs. So you've got no erosion, you've got no compromised water availability or soil moisture content, and you've also got biodiversity. So sort of like this sort of vast experiment. What we found is that, when we included everything in the analysis, you got this trade-off, positive outcomes in terms of reducing erosion, negative outcomes in terms of compromising water supply. But when we took created ecosystems out of the sample, you got evidence of win-wins. So it's that whole thing about we need to be really careful about plantations, as in why are we planting these trees? Is it for wood and erosion control? If it is, then okay, because we need wood. In fact, we need more wood, don't we? Because we're wanting to replace a lot of concrete with wood, and we're wanting to long-term wood store. Carbon can be sequestered for a fairly long time in certain sorts of structures. So it's important. And so, sometimes people think I'm criticizing the forestry industry. Not at all. We need wood, but we need to be careful, be clear on why we're doing it and what funding we're using to enable it. Because we can't, it's not a climate solution really at all. And it could be as part of a journey towards natural regeneration. We have to be careful. So that's that. So there's actually, if you go to that paper, which was published in Global Change Biology towards the end of last year, that shows that we have a box that explores that whole finding, which was a really, really, really interesting thing to find. So hopefully that's answered your question, and you can learn more if you go and look at that paper.
Okay, thank you.
Brilliant, thanks so much. I think we're going to try out our hybrid setup now. We've got a question in person here at South Ken, so I'm just going to pass the microphone over and we'll try it out.
Thank you. Hello, thank you for the presentation and for taking questions. You mentioned the importance of the geographic scale studied in evaluating the impacts of nature-based solutions. Is it also important to consider the time scale? So do some nature-based solutions tend to show benefits early on and others only after decades? And should monitoring essentially continue indefinitely for nature-based solutions? And is that feasible?
A fantastic question. And that's the thing about nature-based solutions. They can't do everything everywhere at once. And so if properly implemented, they can do quite a good job of delivering multiple ecosystem services, but those benefits become, as you rightly pointed out, and I'm really interested in this area, is the sort of the impact of scale. They might not deliver benefits locally like the example about plantations versus, taking local plantations being terrible for biodiversity locally, but being quite good for biodiversity nationally, if it's in a country where it takes the pressure of native forests, for example. So that's an example of where scale is important, but, scale of measurement is important. But absolutely, when you first start restoring a landscape, might bring economic benefits because it might employ people in the process of restoration. And we're actually at the moment bringing together some of the evidence of that, can create jobs in terms of the restoration and ecosystem stewardship process. But in terms of the carbon benefits or the adaptation benefits or some of the livelihood support benefits, that might take several years and for those benefits to become manifest. And I think it's important, particularly important in the tropics. If you're basically, and I mean everywhere really, if you think about it, basically saying people, we need you to start adopting nature-based agricultural practices, and you might have a short-term dip in your productivity or a short-term loss of livelihoods, and so there has to be sort of these compensation schemes, these ways of supporting economically, supporting local communities, but then there's all sorts of schemes. For example, there's an example in Bangladesh where people there's a moratorium on fishing in certain rivers and certain times of year to improve the health and quality of the rivers, and they are given they're paid in terms of rice and other foods by the government during that period. So there's other sorts of ways, and we've got things like environmental land management schemes which have been piloted in the UK, where farmers and landowners in general are going to be compensated or subsidised, not for agricultural practices, but for ecosystem stewardship. And that's really important because all these ecosystem services that we're talking about might not become measurable or financially viable for a few years. And so it's really important to look at that. And the cost effectiveness of a nature-based solution increases over time, because if, as long as you start factoring in the value of all the different ecosystem services, it might be, more, it might be cheaper in some ways, or you might get more immediate benefits for adaptation of an engineered approach. But then over time, the ecosystem is going to be providing more benefits. But this is kind of like, I'd say, is kind of in terms of the research, some of the cutting edge stuff is looking at the impacts of spatial and temporal scale on the effectiveness of nature-based solutions for ecosystems, for people, for climate, and so on, and doing some modelling. And we're involved in work in the UK, which will start out next year, sort of developing a whole load of sort of scenarios on how we could scale up nature-based solutions in the UK under different sort of climate, trade and other policy scenarios, given where we're at the moment, given what can be grown where, given food demands, all sorts of complex things. But we have now the sort of the tools and scientific scenario modelling tools and the big data sets from Earth observation technologies and so on that will enable us to answer some of those critical questions. But you really put your finger on where the cool stuff is. And also the other thing you put your finger on is the fact that when we set up nature-based solutions, we need that monitoring framework. We need technology and citizen science and all sorts of things in place so that we can monitor the health of the ecosystems and the provision of the ecosystem services and how that changes over time. Because in a rapidly changing world, what you get now is unlikely to be what you get in the future. And we need to know that, especially if we're trying to attract finance. And the investors want long-term returns, don't they? So we need to put those frameworks in place at the beginning. Sorry, a very long answer to a very good question. Thanks for asking it.
Brilliant, thank you very much for that, Natalie. Cool, I think we don't want to keep you too much longer, but we might go over to Silwood to try out our hybrid setup even more. If they want to unmute their mic and ask a question from over there. Can you introduce yourself and where you're from as well?
Hi, can you hear me okay? Wonderful. Hi, Natalie. My name is Matthew Hanson. I'm one of the Amherst students over here at Silwood Park. So firstly, thank you very much for the talk. You talked in it a little bit about the sort of hybridization between grey and green solutions to climate change issues. And you showed us the database where you're going to increase the evidence base around sort of numerical targets, how these are good sites that are being used. Do you not think that in quantifying any sort of single success measures, the engineering world will come back with a better numerical approach to that part and say, well, we can solve that in this way? How do we create an atmosphere between engineering solutions and green solutions that isn't destined to be forever turbulent of one helping each other?
I think there's already lots of. It's a great question, but I'm finding with my conversations with engineers are getting easier and easier because of all the evidence that's sort of pouring in from the natural world, well, from the world in the wake of increased natural disasters that we're all facing, whether they're floods or fires. Evidence that where you've got intact ecosystems, you've not got forest fires, for one. Where you've got forests on slopes, you're not getting flooded towns. And where you've got, big, healthy, broad mangrove forests or salt marshes, you're not getting so much damage to infrastructure and property. So there's sort of a lot of evidence pouring in of the value of working with ecosystems. So it's sort of it's getting easier, but we're sort of advancing that as quickly as we can by sort of developing these integrated models. And I'm involved in some work, as I mentioned, with Jim Hall and others over in the Environmental Change Institute, where we're bringing together big global data sets on infrastructure and bringing that together with data sets on biodiversity and resilience to really explore the context, the timeframes and spatial scales over which nature and technology can work together to deliver different sorts of adaptation solutions. Because, engineered approaches might really help you deal with the exposure problem, but they're not going to help you deal with the sensitivity or the adaptive capacity challenge, are they? But they can work together, and there's some really cool modeling that's going on to really integrate all that, because we've got the tools now, we've got the data sets. It's just about the communities getting together to sort of try and understand each other's science and put them together. And of course, and then you can do scenarios, and then you can take that to governments and to businesses that are wanting to invest in new infrastructural projects, and saying, well, your infrastructure is going to be a lot more resilient in a warming world if you also restore and protect and plant up the ecosystems through which these structures are passing. So I think, again, a combination of sort of active engagement between the natural and physical scientists and those and just the fact that the world is warming and natural disasters are becoming more problematic. But equally, we've got to be careful too, because obviously a lot of ecosystems are getting very badly damaged as a result of storms and flooding and fires. I know it's on the radio this morning, lots of trees have come down in the UK, haven't they? And you're like, well, what good are trees as a nature-based solution if they get blown down in storms? And so again, that speaks to the need for multiple solutions, for working with nature and managing it in an adaptive way in a warming world. And I think there's just so much research that needs to inform some of this stuff. So my worry is that all the policy and the excitement around nature-based solutions, especially in the corporate sector, but also in the public sector, is sort of racing along over here. And the scientific engine we have to really do a better job of getting the right science to the people that need it, because you can't, science just doesn't influence policies. I'm sure you're all aware. You have to really fight to get it in there, don't you? So yeah. Long-winded answer to another great question.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. How much time do you have left? I think we've got one more at Silwood and one in the chat. If you can do that, otherwise we might have to say sorry that you can't get to the questions. No, happy to do two more questions, and really pleased that this hybrid. This is the first sort of hybrid event I've been involved with, and it's good, isn't it? It's working out okay. So yeah, it's actually been pretty gone pretty smoothly, which is really nice. Yeah, no, so we're having just a quick plug actually before I answer two questions. We'll be hosting a Nature-Based Solutions in a Changing Climate conference in July, early July next year. The plan, this is something that's been postponed 2 years. We did a digital online version a year and a half ago. We're going to do this event, whatever is going on in the world. It may well end up being entirely online. I suspect, I hope it might be hybrid, but I was a little bit nervous about how the whole hybrid thing was going to work. But you've shown me, Imperial College leading the way as usual. You've shown me that it might all be fine. Brilliant. So yeah, let me answer the questions. Oh, yeah, brilliant. We can inspire some confidence in this format. We'll go over to Silwood again to ask a question now.
Hey, thanks for a really nice talk. I'm Rob, a PhD student at Silwood. I noticed in the talk there was quite a lot of focus on, protecting and kind of particularly in one of the last slides, we were talking about the assessment of native species. But is there kind of like a risk if we are heading to warmer climates, should we not be thinking about kind of which species would be suited for future climates, and kind of should we maybe be transplanting I don't want to say invasive species, but kind of thinking about taking species that are suited to these future climates? And I guess along the same kind of lines, is there an issue with so I know there was a cool study where you're saying plantations were better than naturally letting stuff kind of rewild. But if we are, okay, I thought there was like
no, the opposite.
Oh, that's what. Yeah, sorry, that's what I meant.
Okay.
Yeah. But like, is there an issue that like we're kind of running out of time, and maybe, like for instance, there's a lot of native tree species that take a long time to grow, and maybe we need the benefits sooner.
Yeah, really interesting questions. Absolutely, and I'm very, very keen on and emphasising that we need sort of the right species in the right places, and what the right species are is very changing very rapidly. And the word restoration is actually very misleading, because it's not. We're not going to be able to go back to what we had. It's very clear that ecosystems are dying back, that one biome type is being replaced by another, and that we need to be thinking about doing assisted migration. There's a lot of dieback of different tree species in the UK. We need to be thinking about restoring with regenerating, as a word I'm sort of using more, I think, regenerating landscapes using more Mediterranean, more heat adapted, drought adapted species. We want healthy, functional ecosystems, and we are, I think, it's quite clear, isn't it, that we're going to have to let go of our attachment to some of our favourite native species. I think the point I was making is that, it's important when we look at the impact on biodiversity, it's important that we do distinguish between native and non-native species, and that the problem with existing studies is everything's pulled together. And actually, I think beyond that, it's even more important just think about ecological functions, isn't it, really, rather than species identity. But all of this, I think, points to the need, when it comes to scaling up nature-based solutions, is to think about this. We need to do this in a really experimental way, because it's not clear what the landscapes, the treescapes of the future will look like. So we need to sort of be doing quite a lot of experimenting and learning by doing. So we need to work with landowners and so on in all countries to sort of adopt this experimental approach, where we use different combinations of species from different regions, planted at different densities and different, because it's not clear. We can do a lot of modelling and sort of try and predict an ecological niche modelling and so on, to try and predict what's likely to be the best combination of species or species traits. But there's going to be a lot of experiment is going to be needed. So that's a really, really good point. And I think when we talk about, we should talk more about regeneration and restoration. And again, protecting existing ecosystems is, we have to protect, I think, the evolutionary potential of our landscapes and regenerate that, and give nature space and time to adapt to the changes that we are imposing upon it. And that's why connectivity is an important trait, and why diversity is an important thing to consider. So those are all really good points. There was another point towards the end there that you mentioned, and I've now completely forgotten what it was.
Yeah, so it's just kind of thinking, like, if we have enough time. So I get that it's better to kind of let's say, like, a grassland naturally grow back without assisting it. But do we have time for that to happen?
Oh, the time thing. Yeah. Do we have time for it to happen? Well, I tell you, we do need to pull a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere. The technology that we're going to need is not ready. We're going to need that. That needs to be ready by the end of the century. We need to invest in nature-based solutions now to get the cooling benefits by the end of the century, just from a mitigation perspective. We need to think that through. The problem again, I think again, it's about regeneration, emphasizing, protecting the evolutionary potential of ecosystems being the priority. It might take time, but we have to work with nature in a way to ensure that carbon that's in the biosphere stays locked up, and not get tempted to plant a load of plantations because they very quickly set carbon out of the atmosphere, because those plantations are also very likely to release it very quickly back into the atmosphere, because either they're for short-lived forest products, or because they're susceptible to fire. I mean, these fires that are becoming a massive problem, they're mainly affecting forests where, with very small trees. Big trees are generally much more robust. So I think, again, that speaks to the need of that sort of protecting intact ecosystems being important. But I agree, we need lots of different solutions. We need technology, we need nature-based solutions, we need societal solutions, may well be the most important ones, which, in other words, fundamental shift in the zeitgeist of our relationship with nature and our relationship with the environment. And we definitely don't have time to go there, but societal change, lower consumption, plant-based diets, all that stuff to make space for nature, so that nature can help us deal with the changes that we've caused.
Cool. Thanks very much.
Right. Was there one more question, and then?
Yeah. There's one more. Which was Elnaz in the chat. If you want to unmute yourself and ask the question. please go ahead.
I think we might have already answered that one, haven't we?
Oh, she was like, okay, no. Well,
Yeah,
James,
about the longevity. We addressed that question, didn't we, about the need for long-term monitoring and things.
maybe it's a bit redundant. So James, if you want to answer your question, you've flipped it.
Yeah, hello, and thank you very much for your presentation. I'm interested in the economics of deciding whether or not to proceed with a proposal for an inappropriate nature-based solution. If prices were to reflect the environmental, social, and governance costs of producing whatever it is, would that change the paradigm somewhat?
Yeah, absolutely. The problem is with this sort of offsetting thing that's happening is that, you know, the investments are being made in cheap offsets, which means cheap forestry plantations and things like that, rather than, you know, if things were properly priced, it would be much more expensive, obviously, to take into account equity and biodiversity. And so we need to figure that, you know, that's a whole area of work about how we develop these metrics that reflect the value, the higher value, and that we ensure that the price is sufficiently high that it goes to the right project. So yes, there's an economic mechanism here, and it's all around, the price of carbon needs to be much higher than it is, but it also needs to take into account the value of biodiversity and so forth. So yes, there's an economic mechanism here at the core of this. So it's good to raise that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Brilliant. That takes us then to a long Q&A. Thank you so much for sticking around for that. It's really good. Thank you very much for being with us. And thank you very much for attending the seminar. And it worked out really well to do a hybridly. So I think we might just do it in the future. This recording will go out a little bit later on this week. All I've got to say is thank you very much.
Pleasure. Great.
Cheers. Have a good evening.
See you here. Take care, everyone.